I am 35 years old, and nothing in my careful, career-disciplined life prepared me for the night I found my parents shivering outside my own front door, while an elegant dinner party sparkled inside without them. They are both in their 70s, my father's sternum still tender from a triple bypass 8 months earlier, my mother's hands stiff from years of rheumatoid arthritis. They had given me everything they could on modest means. My father worked 2 jobs for 20 years, his palms rough from labor, yet always gentle when he held mine, and my mother could stretch $1 into comfort, dignity, and celebration. With a partial college scholarship in hand, I watched them empty their small savings without a moment of hesitation. For 4 years they never complained, and when my first promotion arrived, my father cried and said I had exceeded his dreams. I met Robert during a conference panel where our shared obsession with creative marketing strategies felt like oxygen. We slid from coffee to dinner to a whirlwind marriage, and in those glowing early months, he brought my father specialty coffee, fixed wobbly cabinet doors for my mother, and cooked Sunday breakfast before we drove to my parents' house. The first warning signs were quiet. He always took calls from his parents, Nancy and Walter, no matter what we were doing, and their opinions were never merely opinions. They were instructions dressed as concern. They came to our engagement party in coordinated designer clothes and surveyed my parents' modest home with fascination bordering on disdain. Nancy called it charming to see simple living. Walter probed my father's pension and scoffed at prudence. During wedding planning, they tried to control what traditionally belonged to the bride's family, and Robert minimized the affronts by saying they were particular and came from a different world. My career accelerated faster than Robert's, and when an innovative pharmaceutical campaign brought me a promotion and a significant bonus, I suggested we make our long-discussed dream real and buy a home. Walter arrived with printouts of neighborhoods well beyond our budget, and Nancy patted my hand and said, "Generational wealth teaches you to think bigger." We found a Tudor-style home that stretched us but remained feasible because I supplied 70% of the down payment. Robert asked me not to mention that to his parents to avoid disappointing them. I had chosen the house with a first-floor guest suite, specifically for my parents' comfort as they aged. Robert called it practical, but never warmed to it. At their first visit, Nancy swept through with a decorator, pointing at imagined flaws, promising to elevate the space, while Walter said he knew people who could transform everything. As our housewarming approached, I curated a warm, intimate evening that considered my father's diet and my mother's need to elevate her legs, invited close friends, supportive colleagues, and both sets of parents. 3 days before the party, Robert mentioned casually that Nancy had invited a few friends. He waved away my questions and assured me it would be 4 or 5. The morning of the event started bright and crisp. At 10 a.m., I was arranging a vegetable platter when Nancy, Walter, and 6 overdressed couples swept in unannounced, followed by rented florals and remarks about developing my palate while they hid my wine. Robert appeared in a suit, offering that his mother had added a luncheon to elevate the evening. Caterers I had not hired rolled equipment down my driveway, furniture was rearranged, family photos were removed, and I heard Nancy tell a guest that this was Robert's new place, while Walter mused about converting the guest suite into a library. I cornered Robert and reminded him I would pick up my parents at 5:30 p.m. so they could rest and still get home at a reasonable hour after a 6 p.m. start. He looked panicked and muttered that his mother thought my parents should come another time because the gathering had become more formal. I told him I would be leaving at 5:10 p.m. and I expected proper welcome and accessibility when we returned. I left him bathed in his parents' approval and their guests' laughter, promises stacked atop indifference, like the rented floral towers blocking my own mantle. When I returned shortly before 6 p.m. with my parents, my mother in her Sunday best, and my father in the sweater I had given him, our block looked like a valet line outside a private club. A young man in a vest asked if we were here for the Cunningham dinner, and when I said this was my house, he stepped aside, embarrassed. Music and laughter spilled through the windows, far louder than the intimate evening I had planned. I rang the bell and then rapped hard, and through beveled glass I saw faces turn toward the door and slide past it as though the sound were a distant storm. I tried my key and felt it catch on new metal. Someone had changed the locks. The cold pressed in with the dusk. My mother pulled her jacket tighter, and my father's breathing shortened into that careful pattern he used to disguise pain. I went around back, saw patio heaters and string lights I had never purchased, and guests wrapped in warmth we could not access. A server told me curtly to use the front entrance. When I said this was my home and my father needed his medication from the refrigerator, he glanced toward Nancy, who approached the glass with contained fury and told me the guest list had required adjustments, and that perhaps I could take my parents to dinner and return by 11 p.m. I walked back around the house into a rising panic and spotted a basement window left ajar. I wedged my shoulders through, scraped my arm raw, landed on the concrete, and sprinted upstairs through a home I barely recognized. Rented pieces replacing our furniture, an impromptu bar in my dining room, my refrigerator packed with trays that hid my father's medicine. I threw open the front door and brought my parents in, warmed my mother with a blanket a neighbor offered, and guided my father to his pills, while party conversation clattered into silence. Nancy hissed that I was making a scene in front of important guests. I answered that this was my house and my father's life. The room tightened with eyes, and somewhere in the kitchen Robert performed charm for 3 older men, oblivious to the gray in my father's face. When my father folded with chest pain, my mother's hands shook, and I called emergency services without hesitation, gave our address, and described his history. Paramedics barreled through a corridor of stemmed glasses toward my father and said hypothermic exposure had intensified cardiac stress. Walter demanded that I stop the dramatics and insisted it was only a cool October evening. The medics answered by moving quickly. At 12 a.m., I sat in a hospital room and listened to my father's breath, even out under blankets, while my mother thawed, their bodies coming back from a cold they should never have faced. Robert called and asked if I was coming home soon, described my exit as dramatic, and repeated Nancy's view that my parents exaggerate. Something in me broke free, not loud, not spectacular, just sure. I told him not to be there when I returned in the afternoon, that I meant it, that his parents' cruelty and his complicity had crossed a line that could not be recrossed by smoothing words. I hung up and looked at my sleeping parents and decided this would never happen again, not while I had breath and means to prevent it. The following afternoon, the party debris had been cleared, but the stains on the rug and the cigarette burns on the coffee table told the truth. Robert sat at the island with a stubborn kind of fatigue. Nancy and Walter perched on my sofa, postures arranged into injured dignity. Nancy opened with a complaint about the disruption of her successful dinner and the potential introductions it had produced for Robert. Walter advised perspective and implied my father's health was ill-suited to evening events. I asked Robert whether he had agreed to change the locks without telling me. He said his mother had wanted improved security and he had intended to give me the keys. I said I was packing a bag and would be staying with my friend Vanessa, and Nancy called my choice dramatic, then delivered a condescending speech about young wives overwhelmed by the responsibilities of a proper home. Upstairs, I zipped my suitcase while Robert hovered in the doorway and asked where I would go. I said I would check on my parents and then go to Vanessa's, and that he should not call unless there was an actual emergency. Vanessa is a family law attorney, and when I told her what had happened, she said it was not only wrong, but potentially illegal. I checked our joint accounts and found a large withdrawal 3 days before the party. $40,000, supposedly for home improvements. I discovered an emailed receipt in our shared cloud account. $22,000 for catering billed to Walter, not to us. My primary name on the mortgage, because I provided the majority of the down payment, gave me legal leverage, a financial advisor confirmed, even as my stomach knotted at the thought of how easily I could have lost it. Robert's sister called, and with a sorrow that suggested relief at being believed, described how their parents had taken over her home after the birth of her first child and stayed for 8 months until she barely recognized her own life. She said they called it help, that they had a pattern of establishing influence right after big purchases or major changes, then expanding until the house itself felt like one of their possessions. Her story made sense of Nancy's fixation on converting the guest suite, of the decorator's clipboard, of how casually my family photos had been swept into drawers. In the same breath with which I grieved, I planned. I compiled documents, timelines, and screenshots. I spoke to a financial advisor who reminded me to freeze discretionary joint spending and to document every expenditure tied to the party and its fallout. I called my insurer to note the burns on the coffee table and the stains in the rug, and I collected medical documentation for my father's hypothermia and cardiac stress. I prayed clarity would outpace rage, because if I let anger lead, I might win the battle and lose the ground I needed to stand on next. On a Tuesday morning, when I knew Robert would be at work, I returned to the house with a locksmith and a polite police escort that Vanessa recommended given the prior lock change. The locksmith replaced every cylinder and reset the security system, while I walked through each room with my phone as a camera and a witness. In the guest suite closet, I found garment bags with Nancy's clothes, and on the bathroom counter, her lined-up skincare, the choreography of an intended stay. In Robert's home office, I found a folder labeled House Modifications that contained contractor quotes to demolish the guest suite and build a library with a sitting room and to convert our home office into an additional guest space, which I read as a plan to make room for their circle. Wedged among the papers sat a partially completed change of address form listing our home as Nancy and Walter's new residence. The dates on the quotes matched the period just after we closed on the house. Not a conversation, not a suggestion, but a program in motion. With locks secured and documentation backed up, I asked my attorney to arrange a meeting in her conference room, neutral, professional, and unsentimental. Walter arrived blustering that family matters should remain private. Nancy wore the look of someone certain of her status. Robert looked uncertain for the first time. We presented a factual chronology. Lock changes without consent, financial withdrawals without mutual approval, a commandeered event that culminated in elder endangerment, and medical records that spelled out consequences. Walter dismissed October temperatures as mild. My attorney placed the report on the table with the phrases hypothermic symptoms and cardiac distress precipitated by exposure visible on the first page. Nancy called my requests extortion. I called them boundaries backed by accountability. I wanted the return of all funds withdrawn without consent. Written agreement that no modifications could be made without documented mutual approval, no unsupervised access by his parents to our home, and all visits planned in advance, and payment for all medical expenses caused by that night. For the first time, Robert's voice turned toward me instead of toward them. He said he would return the money, would cover the medical bills, would sign the agreement. The word elder endangerment moved like a cold wind through the room, carrying with it social consequences that Nancy and Walter understood in a way they had never understood my parents' bodies shivering on my front step. It struck me then that one of their deepest currencies was reputation, and this incident had banked a debt with interest. The meeting did not repair what mattered most, but it established a new map, clear lines, documented consequences, and the beginning of a record that did not rely on memory or persuasion. The days that followed were an education in how families are formed, deformed, and sometimes reformed. Robert began individual counseling with a therapist who specializes in family dynamics. He told me during a carefully neutral coffee that the sessions felt like someone had opened a window in a stale room. He described a childhood in which choices were not choices, but tasks to complete, for love to remain steady, a life where deviation from Nancy and Walter's vision was punished with withdrawal. He said he had mistaken appeasement for peace, and that he now understood how his comfort had been built on my discomfort, and on that night, on my parents' pain. Understanding did not equal trust. I stayed at Vanessa's and kept my finances separate, while the returned funds posted and the medical bills were paid. Invitations evaporated from Nancy and Walter's calendar. Boards declined to renew their positions. The unspoken code of their circle worked like a tide pulling back from the shore. Robert's siblings called one another and then called me, their voices shaking with stories that matched mine in pattern if not in detail. For perhaps the first time, they said it aloud to one another, "This is how it has always been." Together they decided to name the behavior and to refuse it. My house became quiet, which felt like a blessing after so much spectacle. I spent evenings at my parents' place and found their ordinary rhythms an antidote to the drama. My father brewed coffee at 6:30 a.m. because he liked the ritual even though caffeine made him jittery now. My mother taught me again how to make her chicken and rice without measuring spoons. On Sundays, we re-established our dinners and alternated between their ranch house and my reclaimed kitchen, where we set a cushion in the chair that supports my mother's hips and filled the refrigerator drawer with my father's medication for easy access. I kept a running list on my phone of what forgiveness is not. It is not pretending harm never happened. It is not inviting danger back into the center of your home, and it is not silence to protect someone else's comfort. I added what forgiveness could be, releasing the hope for a different past and guarding the present with clear boundaries so the future has a chance to be healthy. I told myself the marriage would not be measured by words, but by a year of consistent actions. Robert said he understood, that he would show it or he would accept the outcome if he could not. 6 months later, we had shaped a new normal out of the wreckage. My father's cardiology follow-ups set his baseline back to stable. My mother's arthritis remained a daily challenge, but one we worked around with planning and patience. The house I had chosen truly became mine in spirit again. The guest suite remained ready for my parents, and the formal installations Nancy had imposed were either returned or donated. In their place, I hung photographs that spoke of the life we actually live, rather than the life someone else wanted to display. At work, the crisis refined my leadership. I said no with more clarity and yes with more purpose. I recognized manipulation faster and cut it off sooner. Younger women began to stop by my office doorway and ask for advice about setting boundaries without burning bridges. I never told them my whole story. I simply told them that the cost of appeasement is usually paid in private, and that their well-being is not an indulgence but an asset. Robert and I began a tentative reconciliation after 3 months apart. We wrote a relationship agreement with hard edges around anything involving his parents. Limited, supervised contact only, immediate consequences for any boundary crossing, and absolutely no access to our home without both our approval. Nancy and Walter provided restitution for medical expenses because the demand was non-negotiable. The first visit under the new rules felt like a stage play in which everyone read lines slowly to avoid mistakes. Nancy said the house looked lovely, and I accepted the sentence at face value and did not look for the critique beneath it. I did not need her validation, I only needed her compliance. It still strikes me that the most satisfying consequence was not the returned money, or even the social chill that finally reached their insulated circle. It was watching the dynamic shift within Robert as he learned to hear his own voice without waiting for theirs to echo approval. We practiced small trust and measured it over time. He maintained therapy, told his parents no, and did not waver when they attempted to renegotiate the boundaries in softer tones. I learned that vigilance can be calm rather than tense, and that strength can be gentle. My parents, who never wanted revenge and only wanted safety, smiled more easily and reclaimed their Sundays with us. Their faith in me when the night was cold and humiliating has become a reserve I draw from when I feel tired. My mother says wisdom is the art of remembering what you already know and acting on it. My father, who rarely lectures, simply sets my coffee on the table exactly the way I like it, and says that love is proven in the weather, not the sunshine. Looking back at the moment, I found my key useless in my own front door. I see now that a crisis compresses truth into something you cannot ignore. What revealed itself that evening was not only my in-laws' disregard, but also my own threshold. I learned that boundaries are not punishments, they are the architecture of care. Without them, love collapses into performance. Politeness becomes complicity, and safety becomes a negotiation with people who do not have your best interests in mind. The lesson is not that families are enemies. It is that family is defined by behavior, not titles, and that respect is the single non-negotiable ingredient for a home to be a refuge. I also learned that accountability can coexist with the possibility of change, and that you can protect yourself while leaving a door unlocked for someone who chooses to walk differently. If they do not, you still have your dignity, your safety, and your future. If they do, you gain partnership rather than a performance. To anyone who has stood on a porch in any form, literal or metaphorical, locked out of what you helped build, I hope you know that reclaiming your space is not unkind. It is necessary. If any part of this journey resonates with you, I would love to hear your story in the comments. Like if this helped you feel less alone, share it with someone who might need courage, and subscribe if you want more real stories and the lessons they carry. Your engagement helps others find this and recognize patterns before harm multiplies. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for honoring the quiet bravery it takes to set a boundary and keep it.